All right, let's get started. So welcome everyone to the inaugural Project Gen podcast brought to you by the Encounter Ministry of Wake Forest Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I am your host, Ray Sloum, and I am really excited about this podcast series where we are going to explore the words of wisdom throughout the generations, starting from the silent generation, so folks born in 1945 or prior, to Gen Alpha, those born in 2011 and onward. This podcast would not be possible without the support of a vital worship grant from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with funds provided by the Lilly Endowment. So we thank all of those who have made this moment possible. Joining us today to help construct a foundation on which we can build over the next few months is Reverend Carol Howard Merritt, a minister, an author, a teacher, who is known for her insight into how to minister to a new generation. She is the author of the award-winning book, Tribal Church, Ministering to the Missing Generation, and is currently serving as senior pastor for Bedford Presbyterian Church in Bedford, New York. So thank you, Carol, so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Carol, for the next 6 months, we are welcoming a guest onto this podcast who is a representative of a certain generation. And this is starting with the silent generation in December, then a boomer, followed by a Gen Xer, a millennial, someone from Gen Z, and finally, but certainly not least, although the youngest, someone from Generation Alpha. And each of these guests are going to be asked a series of questions that we hope you tonight will be able to help cultivate. And the ultimate goal of this whole series is really to showcase how each one of these generations possess a wisdom that needs to be heard and understood by everyone who may not be part of their kind of generational norm or their generational culture. So to start our conversation, how should we even be approaching this conversation? So perhaps a better way to rephrase this is, what do we need to do as individuals in order to truly open up our hearts and minds to even hear the words of wisdom from another generation?
Well, I just think it's really important to understand and remember how important and almost sacred it is to be thinking across generational lines. For a long time, there was a church growth movement that would really focus on particular generations. I think it started with the boomers. They began this mega church movement that really looked at what boomers needed.
All right, thank you. I really do appreciate all of that. Intergenerational dialogue is, I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's an easy task. And I think a lot of churches typically, they see kind of the appropriate way to minister to a new generation is to start kind of this whole separate ministry, right? That is almost separate from the rest of the church. And something that Encounter is really doing at Wake Forest Baptist is we are a young adult and we are a student ministry. However, we are really trying to kind of bridge that gap and be an integrated part of the larger church of Wake Forest Baptist, and see how that church can really be integrated into the spiritual kind of formation of young adults, and vice versa, how young adults can contribute to that conversation with folks who may have been going to church their entire lives and feel pretty firm in their spiritual roots. So I appreciate that. So Encounter, this is a newer ministry. So we just got started really last January. And our foundation is really centered around 5 core areas. And these 5 core areas include spiritual formation, vocational exploration, holistic stewardship, justice-centered worship, and the personal and communal encountering of God, which is where we got the name Encounter from. And although this is a ministry, like I just mentioned a few seconds ago, it's a ministry that is kind of designed to give young people the opportunity to lead. It is also a ministry that is designed to be fully integrated into the larger worshiping community of Wake Forest Baptist Church. So as we start to think about these different generations, and let's focus for a moment just on this concept of spiritual formation. And what is a question that we could ask a boomer, we could ask a Gen Xer, we could ask a millennial, that would really kind of dive deep into their internal wisdom around spiritual formation?
I think that, so much of spiritual formation has to do with practices and the discipline of doing these things on a regular basis. And so I would be interested in how those practices are the same and how they're different across generations. You have baby boomers who tend to be more idealistic, sociologically. And of course, all the sociology around this stuff can often be very centered on white folks. And so we have to, always keep that in mind. White middle class, academic or whatever, there's all sorts of biases when it comes to these generational ideas. But so as we keep those tensions in mind and understand that, what does spiritual formation, what does the particular practice and discipline look like to a boomer or to somebody in the silent generation or to somebody who is younger, the Gen X or Gen Z and millennials. And Alpha, I didn't know. They've got a name.
Know. It was, as I was doing research around this podcast idea, I was like, I only thought about Gen Z, but there's already this new generation that is past Gen Z.
Right? They got to the end of the alphabet. They got to start a Greek alphabet.
Exactly. We will be, just for everyone else who's watching and listening, we will be interviewing someone who is representative of Gen Alpha a little bit later on. They won't be interviewing until May of 2021. But I am sure that's going to be a really fascinating conversation to hear the wisdom of someone born as late as 2011 or beyond, and how they would address these questions as well.
Yeah.
I'm really excited.
Yes. So that would be the thing that I would be curious about. What about you? When you think about spiritual formation?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you brought up these practices and disciplines, kind of that language, because that is definitely, I think, getting at what I was thinking in my mind. So when I think about spiritual formation, I kind of think about this process where we actually have to kind of undefine what society has put on us, right? So Parker Palmer is famous for saying, since birth, society is telling us who we are and what we are supposed to do and what we're supposed to believe in. And when I think about spiritual formation, I think kind of the first step of that is really how do you unpeel or get rid of all these things that society has placed on you first. And that's the precept to even then looking at your own authentic spirituality and ways that you can relate to God. So I think that happens though through practices and disciplines. And I will be curious as we kind of go throughout this podcast series to see how those differ. So how is a silent generation representative continuing to do that process of kind of undefining so that they can live a more full and more holistic life and in communion with God? So I'll be curious about that.
Yeah, that's really lovely. And just in the church you see different generations and how they older generations sometimes are really great givers. They're very good at stewardship. They were taught that in a different way, or or we may have younger generations who are more activist, more social justice minded. And so it's fascinating, I think, how this sort of takes shape in different ages and stages of life.
Definitely. And so you brought up stewardship. So I'm going to pivot to our next kind of component of this. And I do believe that kind of as we get further down this list, it's going to be really kind of interdisciplinary, right? So the way someone practices spiritual formation may also influence their concept around this idea of holistic stewardship. And once again, Encounter is a ministry centered around kind of that new generation of working professionals, so like the young professional title, as well as students. So when we think about traditional stewardship within the church, the folks who are able to tithe at a regular rate and a substantial rate, that's not necessarily the economic reality for younger generations. So when you think about these younger generations and then older generations as well, how should we be approaching this concept of holistic stewardship?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, when you talk about time, or when you talk about money, or when you talk about all of the ways in which we give of our lives, and stewardship of earth as well, I think that we have to have definite intergenerational understanding when we come to this, because it's really easy for somebody to look at younger generations and just kind of, just sort of tisk at them and be frustrated that they don't give at the same rate or same amount. But younger generations right now have had this unbelievable pressure with housing costs going up, with educational costs going up, and with housing costs going up, and then salaries have pretty much remained stagnant. And so we have a younger generation who is going more and more and more into debt, and that's just a reality that we really need to fight. And I believe we need to really begin to reimagine our society. Also, medical expenses. So I think that as we think about stewardship, and one thing that I have really been affected by is Lynn Twist. Have you ever heard of her?
I have not.
She wrote a book called The Soul of Money, and she talks about abundance and scarcity a lot. And this sense of, do we have enough? And so many times our discussions around stewardship have to do with, our budgets and whether we have enough money to meet the budgets. And, it comes very much down to this bottom line. And her sense is that we have this scarcity mentality. And, and she's trying to foster more of a sense of abundance. And just being able to hear the stories that she brings up has been really, really helpful in reframing how we think about stewardship in terms of abundance or scarcity. So I think, to me, just that focus on abundance would be important. Like, what does abundance look like to you? Or, what does an abundant life look like to you? Because you hear it with our discussions around privilege, around social justice, around money, around socioeconomic issues. There is always a tension of, if I give a little bit up, then I will be diminished. And there is this sense that as Christians, we can come to this idea that we are enough and we have enough and God will provide all our needs. And, I'm one to say that after, just going through that laundry list of what the younger generation is going through. But I think we are having those particular challenges with younger generations because we have not seen our society as a society of enough. We've seen it as one where we just never have enough. We always need more. There's such a scarcity mentality.
That is, that brings to mind, I was at a conference this past summer, and there was let me try and remember what field he was coming from, like a sociologist or something like that, but was quoting a recent study about kind of the salary level where folks are most happy.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is, I think if I'm remembering correctly, it was around like $75,000. And regardless of kind of how far away you were from that number, your life was unhappy, right? So like, even if you were making more and more, which is something the American kind of cultural norm tells us that we have to do, is we constantly have to make more and more money. Once you pass a certain level, like your life becomes not as happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing on the lower end of the spectrum, right? And it's easy for us to grasp why folks making less than $15,000 a year, $20,000 a year, really struggling and unhappy with their status quo. But also, the study was showing that also, like, a lot of money is also showing like you're never satisfied with what you have, and it's this kind of abundance question that you just brought up. So I think that's a great question, kind of as we go through this, and I'll be excited to kind of hear the answers to that from everyone in their respective generations, for sure.
Yeah.
So speaking of kind of money and the way we make money, so another core concept is vocational exploration, and I will say this is an area that's particularly dear to me. So my like full-time job is I serve as the Director of Ministry and Vocational Exploration at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. So I get to have these conversations with everyone who is discerning why they should go to seminary or why they should go to divinity school or what God is calling them to pursue. And one of my kind of core beliefs in this area is that when we think about vocational exploration, we have to think about it in four ways. So, it's not just what does the world need and what am I passionate about, which is something that is often thrown around. Like, to me, there's two more elements to that. So it's, what does the world need? What are you passionate about? What are you good at, right? So like, one of my good examples of this is like, I love drag shows, but I know I would not be a good drag performer, right? So like, I know that I am not being called to be a drag performer in this life. And then the fourth element is, what will the world actually pay you for? And it's also this idea of God is calling us into a work with purpose. So what does that work look like? And with this vocational exploration concept, I know last time I kind of had you focus on the younger generations and how they should, start to think about stewardship. But let's start the conversation around this topic with the older generations, the boomers and the silent generationers who have already retired, or if they haven't retired yet, they're close to retiring and kind of getting this idea of vocation behind them. So what should we be thinking about in regards to vocational exploration?
Well, when you think about vocation, you're thinking about what is God calling us to. And that looks different in each time of life. And I'm strongly Generation X. I am still in my 40s, but I'm like, I think I'm 47 or 48. I can never remember. I'm around there. And so I'm at that time of life where I'm supposed to have it all figured out. But I'm constantly struggling with, like, what is God calling us to? What am I supposed to be doing? Where am I supposed to be going? And, when you look at, people who are retiring, they're still doing the same thing. People are retiring later and later in life both because of economic instability and also because of just because, people still have energy, they still have excitement about their jobs and what they're doing. And a lot of people are starting to think about, well, is this a time when I can write? Or is this a time when I can be an artist? Or is this the time when I can really begin to take on that volunteer work that, I've done as a hobby and begin to explore it in a much deeper way? And I think those questions of meaning and who we are and what God is calling to us to never change. And there is even a sense at the end of life when we begin to listen to God when we are thinking about questions of end of life and how to die well, and all the questions around that, surrounding dying well. And so I think the questions of vocation just never stop, which can be exciting for some people and can also be like horrifying for other people. For me, it's a little bit horrifying. I wish I had it more figured out by now,
Yeah, and I'm like, what's been interesting in my professional role at Wake Forest School of Divinity is that this global pandemic has everyone, reconsidering, what am I called to now? Like, I think I knew what I was called to a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago, but the world has changed, and the world is never going to be the same as it was. Like, this has truly changed kind of our outlook, and it's causing folks to really dig deep again, and really take time to listen to God and what God is calling upon their lives for them to do. And I'll always remember when I first kind of transitioned into this position. My first visitor to campus was actually this older gentleman who really had a career in law and had just retired and felt called to seminary. And I remember having this conversation with him about, like, oh, well, so what do you see as kind of your next vocation? Like, why do you think God is calling you to seminary? And he said, I don't know. And I need to just be in a space where I can figure it out. I can figure out what God is calling me to next. And for him, that was seminary. But I also think just taking time to be, is sometimes the most important step in our kind of vocational discernment, and allowing ourselves to be still and just be present. I'm
really bad at that.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Yeah. So thank you for that. That will also be a very interesting dialogue as we kind of transition through each generation. So the next one is, I think, kind of what people expect churches to be kind of rallying around is this idea of worship. And Encounter specifically is designed to where our worship is justice centered. So to give you just some insight into what we're doing this semester, because of our kind of ministry to college students, the college students of Wake Forest University, we kind of design our worships on a semester to semester basis, right? So right now we're in our kind of fall semester exploration of the book of Ecclesiastes. And to me, there is not a more perfect biblical narrative for the era of COVID and the era of 2020. Like, vanity is vanity, all is vanity. Like, what better book to just, get us in the spirit of 2020. But this is like the author of Ecclesiastes is really one who is spending his time and his resources and his immense amounts of privilege to like try and figure out why we exist and what God's purpose is for the human race kind of on earth. And what's also been fun is to kind of pivot this book on itself and really talk about justice within Ecclesiastes. So there's this king, there's this ruler who it says, well, maybe God is calling us to have pleasure. So he tests this theory out by going out and buying slaves and buying concubines and really, using these things that we just see as morally like wrong today. And yet it's part of our biblical text. So how do we grapple with that as we worship God and yet also understand how God is calling us to justice in our current era. So as we engage this intergenerational dialogue, what question should we be centering our conversation around worship on?
Yeah, I mean, I love the question that you threw out. What does justice-centered worship look like to you? Because I do think, for a lot of people, those two things have to be separate. They have to be different. Justice is what you do, at a different time. And whether people will say, well, you can't mix politics and religion, or you can't, we just can't talk about that. I want to be pumped up. I want my batteries to be charged on Sunday morning. There is a call very much to justice. And so, and justice looks different in different generations because we're all struggling with something different. Oftentimes, one generation may not understand why debt from college educations would be a problem, right? They don't get it because they went to school, they worked part-time and they were able to pay their way through college. Why do younger generations need debt-free college, or why would they be trying for that? But when we can begin to listen to each other and talk to each other and to begin to struggle with the text in real ways, I think justice-centered worship becomes very important. So when we think about what does justice-centered worship look like, I think, as you're saying, taking those practical examples of what's happening in the scripture and applying it to our lives. So looking at the children of Israel, they had to wander in the wilderness and they had to leave Egypt because they were debt slaves, and a lot of people can really understand what it means to be a debt slave, what it means to have to go into incredible debt just to feed yourself or feed your family. So we understand this, but oftentimes we don't frame those biblical stories in a social justice way. So yeah, I think that what does social justice or justice-centered worship look like? Or, how does the scripture inform us as we look at many of these, things? I remember this Graham Greene quote, and I've tried to dig it up so I could get it just right because I never remember it correctly. But there's this, like, some Graham Greene quote from The Power and the Glory. And there's a whiskey priest, and he's listening to different confessions. And at one point, he's like, basically all the sins are the same. Like all of our sins are basically the same. And I think it's that way when we come to societal sin and looking at societal justice, is that we have been doing these things over and over again. We have been not welcoming the stranger. We have been, being oppressed through debt and oppressing each other through debt. We have been, dealing with slavery, and we have been dealing with, so many of these things. They're not new, and we can take those stories of scripture and definitely apply them to our lives when we begin to look at scripture in that systemic sense.
Thank you.
And that's a long answer to say, I really liked your question.
Yeah, no. And I think that's great. And I think one of the biggest challenges for folks is that when you throw out this term like justice-centered worship, typically it turns off the people who are looking for like a deeply spiritual worship. They don't see the two as being able to be in communion with one another. And that's really something that this kind of ministry is trying to experiment with. Like how can we be deeply like spiritual and moving, and then also talk about the hard issues of our day and the hard issues that different generations are facing, that are sometimes the result of another generation's handling of a situation, right? And it's challenging. And justice worship in general is challenging. And then making sure that this kind of spirituality aspect is embedded in it is, it's a task, and we're trying to figure it out as a community for sure. And that kind of brings me to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's so needed though, because if you are around activist communities, many times you realize there's so much soul work that has to be done in order to be a great activist. I mean, there's no doubt why Martin Luther King Jr. was such a great activist, because he was doing that soul work in alongside the activism work, and they just go together, and they have to. And it's very hard to be a spiritual person without starting to look at the dignity of the neighbors that you are called to love.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think when I think about kind of the soul work and activists, and I can say I've been in these shoes myself. Like burnout is real. Burnout is real in ministry, right? Burnout is real, like in really whatever occupation God has called you to. Burnout is real, and like spiritual renewal can help kind of your soul be at peace. And if you need to walk away from a situation, like it can help you make that decision to walk away from the situation, but it can also kind of keep you energized in a healthy way, kind of as you continue to do that justice work. So it is important. And I think Dr. King is a good example of how it can be beneficial as well. So this brings us to our kind of last focus area, and you will see our kind of Baptist roots really come through with this one, and it's the the personal and communal encountering of God. And as we were kind of designing this ministry, we had the spiritual formation bit, we had the worship bit, we had the vocational exploration bit and the stewardship bit, but we still wanted something that was extremely deep and extremely personal, and not only kind of the like person to God, but also how does person to person then relate to God, right? So kind of this communal aspect as well. So when you think about the concept encountering God, what is something that you think we should be thinking about when we're exploring how we can connect to God on this level of encountering?
Yeah. Well, yeah, how do we encounter God? So much of the way I think about it is so intertwined with those spiritual disciplines. And yet, I think being aware of our thin places and being aware of the spaces and the times and the moments and the activities that really bring you to this encounter with God, and being constantly aware of those, I think is extremely important. And sometimes it's takes you by surprise, right? So the disciplines are those things that we're doing on a constant basis, because they're good for our soul and they're important. And sometimes they leave you dry for years. But this encounter with God is, it's surprising. It's sometimes rare. It is sometimes it happens during suffering. Sometimes it happens during times of great joy. So I think, just back to a simple question about, where, how, in what situation have you encountered God in your life, or have you sensed God in your life? And there is some power too in those testimonies of listening to how other people have encountered God. Just hearing those stories is completely important as well. So when I think back in my own life, many times when I've encountered God, it would be a situation where I wouldn't want to replicate, because it's like a time of incredible hardship or a time of incredible suffering. And yet God is there, like, just, it's just massive. So yeah, maybe this would be a time of testimony, a time of storytelling, a time of asking people when it's happened in their life, if it's happened in their life.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it will get at the diversity of how God encounters us humans, right? And my personal encountering of God, those experiences are not necessarily the status quo or what you should even be striving for in your lived reality, right? It's going to be very, very different for each one of us. So I think the testimonial aspect of that will be perfect. I know one of my most holy experiences and where I feel like I truly kind of experience God in a full body way is I was at the Wild Goose Festival, which is this festival that happens up in the mountains of North Carolina. Traditionally every summer. This summer it was postponed due to COVID, but I randomly kind of got pulled into this bourbon and donuts communion experience. And it was like an alumni of Wake Div invited me on, and her and her husband were the ones kind of organizing and leading it. and I'll admit, at first I felt kind of like dirty. I was like, oh wait, I like, should this be how communion happens, right? Like there was some kind of theological discerning happening as I was like walking up to the communion table to grab this shot of bourbon and this like sugary, beautifully glazed donut. And when I like partook of the elements, it was like one of the most holy experiences I had ever had. And it really was this, to think about the death of Jesus and all the theology that is just behind that. And to taste the sweetness of the donut and kind of the thinking about Jesus's body, and then to take this shot of bourbon for the blood and feel your entire body warm up, right? Like if you've taken a shot of bourbon, that's like, that starts in your gut and like your entire body just kind of warms up, your face turns red, unless you're a pro at drinking bourbon, which I am not. And it was like this atonement was happening from within me. And it was like I was experiencing the atonement of Jesus, right? And like just this, all of this happening kind of in the woods and the mountains of North Carolina was like this completely unexpected experience. It kind of happened out of nowhere. And is like one of the most profound encounterings of God I have had, right? And it wasn't even in this time of great joy or deep hardship, which I've experienced those as well. But the testimonial aspect, I think, will be a really kind of fun way to hear about how folks have encountered God on their own personal journeys. So thank you for.
I love about these questions too, in this whole exercise, is that you're really getting at both the differences and the sameness. There's so much of humanity that we have, that we share and that we need to share with one another. So I love that.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for helping us cultivate these questions. It's going to be fun. Like I'm really looking forward to having this conversation every month going forward. But before I let you go, I do want to kind of address, I guess, the elephant in the room. And when I say that, I mean COVID and kind of our new reality. So I'm going to bring up a quote that really kind of spoke to me out of reading Tribal Church. So in that book, you called for the need of churches to understand, and I apologize if I don't get this exactly right, but to understand and reach out to the nomadic culture of young adults. And at that point, you were clearly kind of focusing on the younger generation. And you kind of framed your conversation around like, how do we do ministry to nomads? And I think what's interesting now is that every generation is figuring out this like nomadic way of life now, and it's all virtual, right? So everyone from Silent Gen to Gen Alpha, they're all online. And when they're online, it's not just, the worship at Wake Forest Baptist Church. They also have the worship at every other church at their fingertips. Like they scroll through Facebook on Sunday morning and, everyone is posting their live worship that is happening. So what should we be thinking about? And this is my last question to you before we kind of log off tonight, but how do you think this relates now, like this nomadic culture of Christians in the age of COVID?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I have to start with a little bit of an apology, because when I wrote Tribal Church, I was thinking of the idea of tribes as like a purely sociological category, and so it can sound like pretty cultural appropriation, like I'm using cultural appropriation. So my apologies if it's offensive at all, and we just didn't have that awareness, I think, of cultural appropriation in the same way that we do now. But my intention was very much trying to describe this particular way in which we form communities in our current time with younger generations, how younger generations were forming communities. And so the question, or kind of like a lot of the thesis of the book is, you have people who are moving, oftentimes for education. They have to move away from their homes. They are moving oftentimes, once they get educated, then they need to move again for their jobs, and then their jobs last about 2.5 years, 2.7 years. Many times we have gig jobs. Many times, we're swept up in this gig economy. So we have temporary jobs, we have part-time jobs, we're Uber drivers, we're putting it all together. And so we are in this economy where we're moving all the time, and our roots aren't growing as deeply as they may have historically in our country in the past. So our churches, on the other hand, they're very much geared toward people who are going to be in the community and have been in the community for decades. So we have this church where, you have to be around the church for 10 years before anybody asks you to be part of the leadership. And then you have these really long leadership terms. And then, there's a way in which our churches are structured toward people who are in one generation, in one community for decades. And that's just not how it's working anymore. So how do we form deep, lasting communities in this culture where we're moving all around, where we are working with social media and we're working with digital media, and those deep, long-lasting formative bonds aren't occurring in the same way. And so I think that's our struggle, right? As churches, particularly in this age of COVID. And it's not just church now who's struggling with it, right? Schools are struggling with it. I'm sure that your college is trying to figure out, how do we form these communities in a sense that we need each other, we long for each other, we need to be celebrating with one another. How do we do this when we're not able to physically be together, or when we're not able to be together, in different ways? So people are trying to figure it out. I mean, today, this is being live streamed, so I can say this. Today, right now, is All Saints Day. So we gathered together to remember the people who have gone before us, and then we also gathered online. So we have to create these rituals. We have to create these ways in which we can celebrate together and grieve together and mourn together in this time when a lot of people can't even have funerals right now. So, I don't know that I have like the magic bullet. I don't know that I have the answer that can say exactly what to do. But I think that this is the particular longing and also the our great need as a society right now. And people are connecting in really kind of scary ways. We're seeing this rise of white supremacy. We're seeing a rise of groups that we thought we had completely overcome. And people will say that they are able to find some sort of solidarity in those groups. And I just believe that it is our particular calling in this time, especially during COVID, to imagine ways in which we can form deep bonds with one another, in community with one another. So, and I think encounter worship will go a long way towards that.
Well, I do appreciate that, and it actually gives me some peace when you say we're all still trying to figure it out. So it doesn't make me feel like I'm missing something as I do some of this work around encounters. So I really do appreciate that. And Carol, I really do appreciate you taking the time on All Saints Sunday after doing everything that is required of you as a head pastor. To set aside some time and talk with us today. I am very much looking forward to these next few months and engaging with different folks from these different generations. And there will also be kind of familiar voices for our congregation who will be these guests. So it's not going to be folks that you've never heard of. It's going to be names that if we were in church, you might be sitting next to them, right? And shaking their hands and passing of the peace. But for now, we will be engaging virtually. So Carol, thank you again so much. We really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And for everyone who is listening or watching, if you are not following Encounter on Facebook or Instagram, I do encourage you to go and give us a like or give us a follow. You can find us at Encounter WSNC. So that's Encounter Winston-Salem, North Carolina is the username there. And be sure to set aside this time, the first Sunday of every month at 5 p.m. to kind of watch and listen to a live stream podcast. We are excited to see what we learned from this project. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a great night.
And thank you so much for allowing me to be on it. It's an honor. Love Wake Forest Baptist Church. Love Leah. so I'm always happy to do whatever I'm called upon to do. So